So I'm going to, I'm going to discuss, maybe to have like three main parts for this talk. First of all, I'm going to tell you a bit what I'm doing at the moment. Then I'm going to present you a paper that is kind of summarizes what I've been working on the last couple of years. And then I'll finish by looking at why I'm actually here in Australia, based in the Burra campus in the North Knowledge Partnership, and tell you a little bit more about that and why I'm here. So about my research, as Pascal said before, it's a lot about regional and local development in sparse populated areas, and so when I was working on Rodrigo, and a lot of people that are working with these issues are looking from in Europe are looking at the Arctic perspective. So how these places in the northern parts of the Scandinavia are fit into this Arctic development. What I've been looking at since when I started at Rodrigo, it was like 2004. That I've been looking at how the development in those regions integrates with the mainstream thinking of EU regional policy. So looking from Brussels and how policy instruments and programs are shaped for kind of different types of regions, and how these regions can manage to get the most out of that. So that's, and especially what it means also just to be peripheral in an era of globalization. Does it add new challenges or does it add new advantages? So that's this is my thesis, which wasn't a great bestseller, but so please order it. Well, I'll see it for free. So what kind of the main thing is what constitutes the contours of the local economy in rural settings now in our time. So something that I've been kind of obsessed with during this kind of period is what we call the relational turn of rural development. And saying that nowadays in Europe and probably also, I don't know if it's exactly the same in Australia, but we can have a discussion about that, is that rural development is not only about agriculture. And at the same time, agriculture is not only always directly connected to community development. When we have large-scale farming, sometimes they're not connected to the life on the community. There are many different actors that are coming in, and so that makes it also very interesting to look at what happens in rural development. What new interactions emerges within the countryside, but also outwards. How actors in the countryside, especially in the most remote rural areas, manage to develop new types of relations, and not only to the nearest city, but also sometimes much beyond that. So that's something of interest. And also how it creates new types of values and norms, which are created through these new forms of social and economic relationships. So now I just wanted to flag two main kind of projects that I'm working with at the moment. So this one is kind of a new project that we started, called ESPON Bridges, and it's until 2019. And in that project, I'm going to be the expert on sparsely related areas. And ESPON, it's a cooperation program that is set up by the European Commission, and it finances applied research to get new knowledge about how to improve the effectiveness of EU cohesion policy. And usually what is interesting in these kind of projects, like it's transnational project teams. And it's very applied research. So trying to develop methodologies about how to research, but also trying to focus on what are the implications for policymakers, and especially what are the implications for the policymakers at different levels, of different strata, European policymakers, but also national ones and regional ones as well. So that's very interesting. And what we're doing and what we're going to do in this project is to investigate the kind of the development challenges and opportunities that of what in the EU jargon is called the areas with geographic specificities. which is sparsely populated regions, mountain regions, islands, including island states, and also coastal areas. So all these regions, these areas that have very specific geographical, topographical features, how can they make the best of for their local development? And kind of one of the main questions for this project is how can place-based, smart and integrated approaches may support the challenges encountered by territories with geographic specificities. So that's up to the mid-2019. And then there's a book project that I'm working on as well, which is a collaborative book for Routledge, and it's a long title, Strategic Approaches to Regional Development, Smart Experimentation in Less Favored Regions. So what we're trying to do here is to try to examine what maybe new ways that regional authorities or local authorities trying to promote development in their areas, and to try to find new ways of, because I mean, as I said before, the main policies are made for urban areas, urbanized areas. And so there's a need as well, especially in Europe, when there's this, the new regional innovation policies, which is called smart specialization. And which is on paper, it's great, but no one has really a good knowledge of what it means in practice and how to implement that a bit. So because it's not anymore just to bet on your local champion and just give them money, it's to try to what is called the entrepreneurial discovery, so more than an open innovation process. And again, something this is made, although it's not explicitly written on paper, but it's really made for more core region, urbanized regions. So there's a need also just for sparsely populated areas and peripheral regions, just to understand how can they as well develop these kind of smart strategies, which is smart not in the kind of that everybody has 10 years ago that everybody had to have the biotechnology clusters, but really to try what is the most appropriate for this region to focus on in order just to promote long-term development. So smart in that sense, that try to find which is more realistic and durable. So that's something that also should be hopefully out next year. So the for this talk, I chose to talk about a paper which is we get published on Sunday in the Journal of Rural Studies. So it's very fresh. So I just want to use this freshness to tell that. And because it's at this point it summarizes a bit what I've been doing the last couple of years. So I started my postdoc at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences at the Division of Rural Development in April 2015. And as you know, it takes a lot of time just to get to get the empirical material done, and then analyze it, and then get it published. So it's fairly to about less than 2 years and a half. It's all right. It's all right. And so in my postdoc, I had the kind of a short text, which was my kind of mission, was to try to look at maybe the new what's the new role of agriculture from a rural development perspective. So I wasn't really sure what to do at first at the beginning, but then I found some literature that kind of connected with what I did before, which is the one on Attentive Networks, and the one as well on short food supply chains, and then I found things that I've been working on before. When I was doing my PhD, I was looking at small firms in the north of Sweden and trying to understand how this kind of isolated firm, you could say, from how they managed to establish new types of relations, both in their surroundings but also outwards, just to keep being competitive and develop. Although this time it was the other way, kind of the other way around, trying to look at how do you reconnect people that that may be very close, but are not part of the same value chain, or very far away from the value chain. So this is kind of an illustration. I didn't do it. I don't even know. It's part of the book. That's what I know, but I don't remember which one. So I'm sorry for the author of the illustration. So that's kind of, as I said, the typical modern farm. And I mean, I like this illustration because it shows a bit that farms are engaged in very complex types of relationships. And these relationships are, of course, about the shipping goods and commodities. There's a lot of trucks here, but also just the flows of money, of course. What I find quite interesting, so it's very kind of, the modern farm is embedded in very wide, large networks of actors. What I find was quite interesting is that here, we have the consumers. And in this kind of modern farm illustration, there's no direct connection between the farm and the consumer. So at best, it goes through some bakeries, retailers, or to wholesalers, restaurants. There's not even a direct connection between, for instance, the farm and restaurants. So more kind of local actors, we would say. So that I find that's quite interesting to say that, well, does this summarize what the model is? Or are they all different ways also just to create a food supply chain? So that was a bit the start of my reflection. And as I said before, is that the consumers and the farm, sometimes they can be in the same village, or they can be in the same, within 30 minutes. But because how the conventional industry is shaped, there is no direct relation between these two. And the products can go a long way before it comes back. And I find that actually, although it looks kind of simple, but how do you reconnect these two? How do you kind of try to find new ways of reconnecting the farm with the consumers? And that's a bit what has been my reflection, and I've tried to interpret this kind of what the role of agriculture in terms of community development or rural development. So that's the highlights of the paper. That you have to write highlights, so I thought that I might use that as well. So just so that you know the end of the story, what I found in this paper is that small-scale producers are indeed engaged in multiple types of short market arrangements, and they do that simultaneously. And then you have social, cognitive, and temporary geographical proximities. I'll come back to that, of course, later. Contribute to creating shortened food relations. And although face-to-face interaction is still very important to create this kind of direct link, especially in the initial phases, there are other ways, for instance, box schemes or farm shop, where the relationship is created in a very different way, maintained in a very different ways, and they. So a little bit about Attentive Networks, just shortly. They come in very different shapes and flavors. You have farmers market, farm shops, farm gate sales, also community-supported agriculture in the EU context, and then box delivery. So they're very different types of ways, and some are very. So what comes back in the Alternative Food Networks literature is that they're talking about local food system and short food supply chains. And some point of my reflection as well is that are these two exactly the same, or are they actually different types of food supply chains? Does local mean short and the other way around? And also what is also interesting after reading a lot from this literature is that there's a lot in the AFN literature about practices. A lot of empirical work has been done, so it's kind of massive. All these experiences, but something that is kind of missing is that there's some kind kind of homogeneous theoretical understanding. I'm not saying that. They are saying good mind, which is working a lot on that. So I found that there was some I would say some gap and somewhere where I could try to contribute that, of course, humbly, of course. Something that came up as well in this when reading this literature is the relationship, the role of distance in the food supply chain. And what has been written is that there is some kind of a process of distanciation, as I talked about before, in the producer-consumer relations. There's not only long physical distances between where the product is grown and where it's actually consumed, but there are also increasing intellectual and cultural gaps that are on the way, so that we don't actually know how we have no knowledge about how the food is grown, and we don't have knowledge about who is growing the vegetables. So this distanciation was kind of interesting to read, and of course, so in the AFN, what the farmers that are engaged in this form of market relations, what usually they want is to gain some autonomy from the industry. So they have the ability just to create their own version of the food supply chain, and this has been framed in terms of re-specialization and re-socialization of food production and consumption practices. And there's a lot, what has been the key terms that have been coming up in this literature is about re-embeddedness, reconnection, and these kind of processes. So if we look at the key features of what the local food is, it's about shortening the distances between where the food is grown and when it's consumed, but also what's called a thickening of the producer-consumer relationship. So get to know better. There's some kind of social reconnection in that term between the producers and the consumers. And of course, more direct relationships when there's a recognition between the two. And also find new ways of entertaining this relationship. And also the role of internet also as well, just as a way to maintain this relationship has been quite important. What has been also flagged in the literature that there's what I was trying to say before, that there was some kind of the problem of the conflation of these kind of embedded relationship to kind of the local, as it was exactly an equivalent, that highly embedded, socially embedded relationships are local. And we know it's not correct. So that was kind of the simple equation. A little bit. So that I thought when I was looking at this short food supply chain, that near in geographical terms and close in some kind of social term, are they the main feature of these short food supply chains. So short food supply chains, again, reduce the distance between where food is produced and consumed, and that there's no intermediary, as we said before. There's a direct relationship between the farm and the consumers, and this is kind of an ideal way, and we'll see that it's not always easy. So sometimes there are intermediaries, but it's not the same intermediaries as before. So different, even when there might be some intermediaries, the nature of the relationship also changes. And the motivation most of the time for producers is to get some higher profit margin in how they sold, because for instance, if they're organic producers, they're able to sell, to market their products and get a little bit higher profit margin. So that's the entry motivation as well. So that's a nice picture. So in different columns, for instance, you have the box schemes where people are able, for instance, to buy 20 kilos of meat, especially through mail orders or internet orders and farm shops. But something that I've looked also in my empirical work is that it depends a lot on external factors. Broadband, for instance, the ability to be on Facebook or just to have mail order, you need to have the internet. So there are other actors that may influence rural development as well in terms of broadband rollout. Some weeks ago I saw a TV show, it was on ABC, and there were some debates in Australia, or at least in South Australia, about broadband. I've experienced that firsthand in Burra. But also roads as well, just to be. But also what is interesting is that it requires also the farmers to acquire new skills and competencies as well. It's not just about producing food. It's a lot about marketing, and it's a lot about networking and things like, making a nice label on your product. So it involves also a very different types of skills that most of these farmers didn't have prior knowledge of. So something that got me into, if we look at the conceptual background more in this paper, is the notion of proximity, which I've used before in other contexts. And then I thought that because in French, all this alternative food network is called like an agriculture de proximité, so an agriculture of proximity, which I translated. And the proximity is very interesting because it has very different, can have very different meanings. So in a sense, it's vague enough so that so we can have a kind of more theoretical debate around that. But because it brings together the idea of, yes, it's a bit about being close in geographical terms, but there are also some different other aspects, social, cognitive, and also institutional aspects. So I tried to look at the empirical work that I did through this notion of proximity, and which is proximity. It's about the ability of actors to collectively coordinate their actions, and also and also the ability of individual farmers to navigate these relationships as well. And in the literature, there are two main types of geographic proximity that is defined. So proximity, geographical proximity, as you can read, and then organized proximity. And what I've been quite interested in is the interaction between the two and how they may or may not fit into each other. Something that also has been quite interesting in the literature, and especially by André Thor from the INRA in France, is that then there are ways as well to have this kind of face-to-face event that are dense in interaction, but are just temporary, like for instance the farmers market, where you can exchange information, where information can pass, when you can reconnect, you can develop relationship, but you don't have to be co-localized all the time. You don't have just to be neighbors. And something that is a metaphor that I think of, that is why we, as scholars, we're going to conferences as well. When I sit in a corridor, sometimes you just sit with people that are very close to you, but you don't often interact with them. But then you want to go to a conference where you know that people that are, you can meet people that are kind of thinking in the same terms as you are. So that's been also very interesting, and I'll see how I've used that. I'll tell you how I've used that afterwards. And also what has been also interesting, so the possibility of organizing interaction at a distance. So they don't always have to be physically here to maintain the relationship. Okay. So in terms of organized proximity, there are some the literature which is mainly about from innovation studies, but there was the initial what's called the School of Proximity Dynamics. We come from France from the early 2000s and the 1990s as well. It was a lot of rural economists that actually developed that. And now it has been a bit taken by regional innovation studies, and for instance like Ron Boschma. But what they identified 5 different forms of organized proximity: cognitive, organizational, for instance, when you're part of the same project, for instance, or the same team; social, institutional, when the trust is maintained through kind of common norms and values, and of course, geographical. What some of this literature has also shown is that these are not clean-cut types of modes of proximity. So there's a lot of synergies, and sometimes depending on the phenomenon that you look, there are different ways for these modes of organized proximity that interplay with each other. And a model that André Thor has developed is that, well, if you look at this proximity from a kind of evolutionary perspective, you can see that how these relationships are developed are in kind of 3 main phases. In initial phase, when the relation is built, and it's dependent on having a strong interaction. Then the relationship is maintained by what they call ubiquity, so ubiquities, when the interaction is maintained at a distance. And then thanks to that, you can also develop more punctual meeting, face-to-face meeting, that try to consolidate this kind of relationship. So this, I've used this model from Thor actually by looking at my empirical material, and I'll show you a bit later, of course. And of course, so proximity is not new actually in the AFN literature. It has been used like already in the early 2000s. But what came from this literature, for instance, by Rending and Murdoch, is that usually organized proximity is used as a substitute for geographical proximity. So if you don't have, so you try to compensate for the lack of geographical proximity by using different types of relation devices to maintain this interaction. So that's so, and also what also come also in the in studies that have used proximity is usually by kind of trying to build some kind of grid between geographical proximity and organized proximity, and to try to look at this in terms of weak and strong, and to try to find cases where, for instance, these farmers market, for instance, let's take this one, it's strong in terms of geographical proximity and then strong in terms of organized proximity. So to try to do typologies that are kind of using these two. Something that I felt was kind of a bit missing is to try to understand how yes, so the literature didn't use the different types of, for instance, organized proximity. So they look at organized proximity as kind of a coherent process. so what I thought that there was something that could be quite interesting to look at as well in this by trying to use a bit more the different modes of proximity to understand the process of how farmers are engaged in these short food supply chains. So again, so the shortcomings from what I saw, of course, is that is it always so that organized proximity is only a substitute for geographical proximity? Because this suggests that producers and farmers prefer to have face-to-face interaction with the consumers. So is it always like that? So that's the first one. The second one was there's a lot about social embeddedness as the main mechanism by which trust is created between producers and consumers, and also trying to look, is social proximity, is it so that social proximity is the main mechanism? And how, and that other modes of organized proximity as well just substitute when this social proximity is not available. Something also that felt was a bit unsatisfying is that can you just see proximity as a gradient? You have weak and strong. Is it as basic as this type of dichotomies? And then also what it means when we say that producers are simultaneously engaged in multiple types of market relations, to try to understand, are they, I would say, cannibalizing each other? Is that if the traditional venues are maybe abandoned for kind of more structured interactions. For instance, if you just, I'm not going to the farmer's market, I'm just selling my products online, for instance. So that these shortcomings, which I have to admit, I think they came a bit in the they came during my empirical work as well. These are reflections that came as well during this time. So the main research question that I focused in this paper was to try to understand how different types of market relations can be maybe characterized as some kind of construction of one or more modes of organized proximity. So how do they contribute to that? And also how, when we say that, and how do we individual producers mobilize different modes of organized proximity at different moments of their development in order to, in the end, be able to engage in these kind of multiple types of market relations. So the case study, so that's, you will recognize Sweden. That map was, when I was working at Nordego, there was a folder in my office, because as usual people never took their old folders. And it was actually from the early 1990s, and it was some papers that for a study trip for people in the European Commission, organized by people, by Swedish and Finnish authorities when they were negotiating their entry in the EU, which happened in '94. And that's what, and I find that there was one of these, just how to explain to somebody in Brussels what Sweden is like and what's the, and so you have Sweden, you have the north, and then you have the northern inland. Because of course this you have Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö, which are the three main metropolitan areas. Here you have, it's still urbanized, you have Umeå must be around here, maybe, something like that. And then you have different, so it's kind of urban. But here is where this part is mainly made of, first of all, there's a strong legacy of natural resource extraction, mining, of course, and forestry in those areas, but also the settlement structure is more about small settlements and very distant from each other. So I think that was it. And what I'm looking at is the county of Västerbotten, which is basically this slice of Sweden. And what I've been also interested in trying to see how it changes, how these the change of the landscape and the change of the urbanization degree from this area with Umeå as a kind of growing university town to the inland communities, how it changes as well in terms of the ability to develop short food supply chains. So again, the paper is based on kind of a small sample, 9 producers. It's still ongoing, so I mean that was for me it was just a way as well to test some of these ideas and to get some of these ideas published before continuing and trying to build upon them. And so from these producers, 6 are around, like I'd say around Umeå, like between 30 and 60 minutes from Umeå, and 3 of them are more in the inland. And now in the second round, which I'll talk about later, I will also focus more on the inland part and try to look at inland producers. So what is interesting with this region is that it challenges, of course, the common sense of what proximity is about, because there's a lack of critical mass, I would say. So it challenges the way geographic proximity can be used as kind of a main mechanism to develop this kind of short food supply chain. And something that also came in that I found very nicely put is that it's that this peripheral position, not just geographically, but also away from the hotspots of productivist conventional agriculture, also can also be kind of used as a spark for local producers to develop different types of food supply chain and to the development of quality food niches. So when I analyze these kind of the story, the development trajectory of these farmers, so I try to find different how they at some points they mobilize different modes of organized proximity. So to try to see how, for instance, when they went to the farmers market or box schemes, what were these kind of relational mechanisms that they used to develop. So I use this. So this is kind of the typology developed by Renting, and which differentiate between face-to-face types of market relation, proximate and extended. And then I try to look at them, not just in terms of geographical and organized proximity, but to try to look at these different modes. What is interesting is that in the classic Avon narrative, this is the reading usually that we get. So we're looking usually at farmers market and to try to look at the story of the farmers market, or both schemes and to try to look at that. And what I try to understand is that, actually, well, when the producer is at the farmers market, for instance, so it gives them through temporary geographical proximity, it creates some kind of incubator for developing social proximity with a loyal base of customers. But usually, this base of customers, many of these producers use that as a kind of starting point to develop a boss scheme, because then they can send an email to these returning customers and say, oh, by the way, because of course in Umeå the farmers market is only 6 times a year in August. So if you want to sell products during the whole year, you need just to find different outlets. So they use this social proximity to develop a new type of market relation. So to try to understand how the ability of the producers to engage in different types of market relations can be understood better by looking at these different modes of proximity. And then they are able also, for instance, to use these different mechanisms through different means, for instance, the internet or email or telephone, different specialities where they don't. Of course, you can deliver a box much further away than if you just have to go to the market. And also the temporality as well, so you can sell products to supply to consumers at different points in time during the year. And then I kind of try to use the André Tor's model, which wasn't really developed for this purpose, but to try to see how it fits with what the empirical observation that I did. And for the majority of these producers, it's usually started at the farmers market, where they manage again just to find a loyal base of customers, and then of course and then they manage to maintain this interaction with these customers through different means. For instance, there was a producer. He was selling bus schemes every week, so he was sending every week a mail to his customers. And for instance, he used instead of trying to market flyers anonymously, he said that, well, to this kind of circle of customers, he said, well, if you know somebody who is would be interested in that, pass this email forward. So he managed to get a much wider kind of circle of customers by cooptation as well, so that existing customers are coopting new customers. So that also, and they could try to manage this relationship kind of at a distance. But then the third one is that when the producers have reached this point, when they have some kind of, I would say, their network rolling, they are more in control about when and where they want to meet the consumers. And for instance, they are organizing, for instance, events on their farm, or they are participating in events in their village. So they have a bit more control about where this relationship takes place and on the terms of this relationship with the customers. So that's what was it, and usually it's kind of looping back as well. The producers usually continue to go to the farmers market as well, just to maintain this relationship. So this, so it's kind of this, the kind of interplay between these three main phases, actually, that led the producers to be engaged in multiple types of market relations and to gain again this autonomy that we discussed before. So again, what this engagement is made possible by what André Tor said, that the relaxation of the constraint of geographical proximity. It's not that geographical proximity doesn't matter, it's that there are ways to kind of bypass that, to compensate, and to maintain relationships at a distance. So what is interesting is that each producer then developed their own version of the food supply chain. There's no blueprint of how do you develop this kind of short food supply chain. And again, the model is not just something that just said you should do that, you should apply that, but it shows that it's the engagement of producers in multiple types is built, are feeding into each other as well. It's not that I'm specialized in farmers market and doing all that, but for these producers where farmers market is a limited outlet, they need also just to be able to be engaged in multiple types of market relations. Okay, what was interesting is that, and that's also something that I've been looking at for small manufacturing firms in the North, is that there are business, what it shows a bit, it's there are different ways of building a business model that are not only based on economies of scale, but for instance, in the case of these short food supply chains, more in terms of economies of scope, and which is essentially about diversification, trying to find multiple channels, and also the fact that when and that's the marketing part as well, is that the consumers, when they're buying products from specific producers, they're usually not just buying a product, they're also buying a concept. They're buying, so there are very different types of new values that are generated, and not only in terms of crowns or dollars, but also in terms of very new kind of values that are shared between the producers and consumers about what are the main tenets of a living countryside. Animal welfare, for instance, is something that creates a bond between the producers and the consumers, caring for the landscape, but also this kind of educational, and that's also an interesting point for what role these farmers have for not only rural development, but just development, say human development, is that the education, try to pass values to future generation about what it means to grow healthy food and organic, or and to trying to reconnect as well. And that's also a point where, for instance, where urbanites can also learn by interacting with the more rural farmers. So the field was in Burra, and so I arrived, which is why I'm not here. Yes, here, but so I arrived in South Australia in early October, and of course I met Dean Garson that you 4 or 5 years ago. I don't remember, at a seminar in Sweden, and we've written a couple of articles together. And earlier this year, we submitted an application, a grant for a project that tries to do a comparison between South Australian experiences and North Swedish experiences of local food, we may say so. So we'll see on Friday if we get it or not. So it's so before I did a little bit of research, of course, before coming to Australia, and looked at, okay, what's the literature in Australia about these kind of alternative food network, short food supply chain. And I just say not a lot. There's not a lot of articles that are using these kind of concepts. So either it's because there are no alternative food networks in Australia, but I doubt it. Or maybe it's because maybe the importance of say conventional industry that kind of overshadows a bit these kind of more experimental endeavors to develop this kind of supply chains. But I found a couple of very interesting articles. There are some more, but that's very biased, of course. That just what they were saying, and there were definitely some very interesting things that I can build upon when doing the comparison. So Andre and his colleagues said that, for instance, these markets, talking about these new alternative food networks, provided economic options for farmers precisely at the point when competitive productivism was forcing them to find new direction or get out of farming altogether. So that's very interesting because it enables farmers who could also just to stay in business and to trying to, for different reasons, of course, and to try to do something in parallel. Generate reasonable income, something that also is something that has been it's a motivation as well from my empirical work. What is not really the case in the Swiss example is that when they say that usually these direct sales are just a stepping stone to export. And that's I think that's a really big difference between the Australian perspective and I would say the European perspective on these types of short food supply chain, because in the European context, they are not only the means but also the end of the end goal for developing, to recreate this kind of social connection. In this case, it's more in terms of how you get to generate more revenues by selling abroad. And then the three goals for producers to participate in these types of endeavor was to capture greater value in the supply chains, to be independent, to make independent decisions, and then also just to make decisions that protect and enhance the environmental sustainability as well. So the environmental kind of values surrounded by that. Another interesting, by Dixon and Richards, is that that was very interesting, the social solidarity between urban consumers and rural producers. And that's something as well that came up, especially for the producers that are the closest to Umeå and that participate into the farmers market in Umeå, of course. And they tried, for them, they managed to get a new relationship with some urban dwellers. And also when they started there to go to do some farm gate sales, it gave the opportunity for people living in the urban area just to go to the countryside and just to experience as well, and to recreate this link between the town and its surrounding countryside. And I'll leave that. So what I've been doing is kind of a pilot study of this grant that we applied for, and the end, what was said in the grant application was that we wanted to investigate how changing local climatic conditions and urbanization affects the reconfiguration of agriculture community linkages in small communities that are located on critical climatic lines. 5 minutes? It's just this, just for the slide. And what we were looking is that from the literature who's talking about the uncoupling between agriculture and community development to this alternative network literature, which talks about reconnection as well, so to trying to use. And I've been doing about 10 interviews with producers over there in South Australia, and of course the case study regions that we have this is from Dean and Doris and others as well. So we use that as well. This is the North Swedish case with what's called the Western Lapland. And you can see, for instance, here that's this line, which is called the Woodlings Grandstand, which is the agricultural line, which is kind of it was, in the case of Sweden, it was a cultural line that separated the land that could be used for herding, reindeer herding, by the Sami population, and then the land that could be used for agriculture by settlers. And this also impacted the settlement pattern of North Sweden. And of course, the settlements, they don't move. They grow in terms of population, but they are still there. And here, looking at kind of in parallel with the Goyder's line in South Australia, which is more some kind of more climatic line, but that has also impacted also the way settlers who wanted to do agriculture have populated this area. And this idea of the grant is that when this climatic, if we say that these represent some kind of climatic line between arable land and non-arable land, as it shifts that direction, so with like warmer climate in North Sweden, and it shifts in this direction, in South Australia, how it changes also the opportunities for producers that are on the edge of these lines to develop different types of food supply chains. That was it. The sponsors, of course. Charles Darwin University and the Mid-North and Nordish Partnership, the Burra campus. And in Sweden, to come here, I got some small travel grants from these friends. So thank you very much for your attention.
In order to facilitate the kind of proximal relationship you're talking about. So here, when you used a phrase in there which was paddock to the plate or something similar. From before. Yeah. So we're seeing that here, that certainly the Meat and Livestock Association and the Land-Based Australia are talking about how international markets are very interested in having that close relationship with the farm in information about their food, including the individual naming of livestock, the electronic monitoring of that livestock, and then that information relating directly back so they get the information about the food that they're about to eat. But we're seeing the same relationship emerging, or the desire for a similar relationship emerging in migrant communities. So in Darwin, for example, we have migrant communities that are, we moved to sort of larger scale farming, and then we had a lot of Vietnamese move in, and they brought elderly parents who were quite productive, and those elderly parents reinvigorated a massive market garden sort of process, and now we have quite a lot of boutique. I say that because they're really expensive, but we have quite a lot of shops here that are engaged in managing the perception of that close relationship with a localized farm. And my wife buys most of her food from one of those particular vendors. And a very big resurgence in probably the last 8 years in weekend markets and direct farmers coming into them, which was the preferred way that people are engaging in buying their food in a higher income bracket, which is strange because I thought it would be people who couldn't afford the markets are much cheaper. You would surely go there to balance, but that's not what's occurring.
I think, thank you for the comment. I think there's this issue of transparency is kind of very important in the case, for instance, when I talk to these producers, and that they could, when the consumers ask questions about how the animal welfare or how it was grown, that they could just give them information, and then based on this information, usually the consumer is very satisfied. And for instance, something that I'm working on more in my paper is just, for instance, that about certification, organic certification. As most of these producers that we interviewed, they see themselves as organic farmers. Some are certified, but some are not certified because it costs money and it's kind of bureaucratic. And then they said, well, I don't need to be certified because I'm very transparent. So the customers, my customers, they know what they're getting. They can ask me, they can come to the farm if they want. So this kind of that you don't need, for instance, this kind of all institutionalized types of certification just to convey this message. Something that was kind of, I like when you said about the newcomers, that they also have a positive impact as well. One of these farmer friends, he's selling vegetable boxes, and when I ask him who are these customers are, they are mainly based in Umeå. Say, well, a lot of them are from other European countries, because people that work on the university in Umeå, and that are coming from countries where there is a stronger culture about food, which is not really the case in Sweden. So that they will also, by coming to Umeå and by wanting to buy this through these kind of small scale farmers, that they also reinvigorated the way to sell these products. Yes, please.
Thanks very much. I'm an ecologist learning about agricultural systems, so just exploring things by making comments and asking questions on that. My name's Penny. Yeah, I just wanted to explore that idea of values and culture. Just reflecting on Australian agricultural history is sort of traditionally the picture of a huge harvester mowing through massive fields of wheat that we need to feel proud about, and sort of shifting then into the reality of Coles and Woolworths dominating agricultural production and squeezing farmers and forcing people into sort of debt arrangements and focusing on certain types of equipment that then creates debt situations for those producers. And there isn't that sort of cultural appreciation of boutique food production, generally speaking. I mean, there is the previous question has just described that there is, but yeah, that sort of values shift is, and people like a cheap deal, sort of buy cheap brands. So we're sort of stuck, I think, or needing to develop a lot of cultural awareness and awareness of benefit flow and who's benefiting from particular arrangements. So am I benefiting for cheap products at Woolies is actually causing trauma and change in the whole rural demographics really. It's sort of a lack of awareness of that, I feel.
Yeah, I think it's something just to reflect on what you said as well is that I don't think that this type of production will eventually replace the whole conventional food industry, but I think it complements it in a nice way because it's exactly. Because it, again, not just because it's you can get because now the supermarkets they also have organic products, so you can still buy from relatively healthy food, I would say, from the supermarket. But how these types of short food supply chain contribute to, it's more the community development, to be part and to bring together as well consumers and producers that are like-minded, that care for the landscape, that care for the animal welfare. So much more in terms of value, and then if it ends up being a bit more viable for these farmers, it's good. But most of these farmers, in these households, that's a tricky one. They often have one person working out off farm as well, as a normal job as well. So it's not that it's not going to keep you rich, of course, but that's a way. Just if that can keep some farmers caring for the land, and that caring for and also consolidating this bond between that mainly urbanized communities are to the relation to the land. That's interesting.
There's sort of a more complex set of values driving that particular sector than there is, say, the more economically focused, traditional or industrial agriculture.
I just want to give two very quick examples that might be helpful. Example number one would be Uber, the taxi service. Uber came out as a network, challenging the hierarchy of a taxi company, and for 7 years they avoided paying tax, which is not a bad idea. They also avoided any form of legislated quality assurance. When you're talking about these sort of markets, and what I've observed in Austria in a similar process, is these alternate new information technology allows connections of proximal relationship to farm direct with consumer, etc. But it skips a lot of legislation, it skips a lot of quality assurance layers, and it's profitable for the farmer until they get to a certain size of effectiveness, and then they start competing heavily with the hierarchies, and they get shut down. So an interesting question here would be: at what point is it? How under the radar of legislated quality assurance processes are these markets running in order to be sustainable?
But that's heavily regulated. For instance, when they get you, if you want to, for instance, set up a farm gate shop, for instance, there are a lot of rules and regulations that you need to follow. So it's not that you can just open the trunk of your car and sell. So so these places also are regulated.
It's not a black market.
No, not like that. It's not a black market. Then I think relevant point from what you're saying is that, and that's something that I also have been looking at different cases, that can you just scale up? Is scaling up the only way to develop this kind of business models? And I don't think that you can scale up at some point these are small scale producers, and most of them, they want to stay small scale producers. So what they want is to try to increase their margins to have a better livelihood. But it's not to expand the farm into something that is much bigger. So I think that's also maybe some of them will end up becoming a big online vegetable retailer, for instance. But most of them they will keep, and they're trying to and that's why they're engaging multiple types of these market relations, because just to find new ways of selling their products to generate. And that's also most of them they're involved in food manufacturing as well, learning how to make jams or just to increase them. And I think that's so I think that they're trying to develop a business model that is not meant to be scaled up, because if you scale that up, it changes you cannot do these type of things on the larger scale.
So there's much more in terms of changing the bargaining power of the farms than there is in some sort of avoidance of legislation in any form, as far as you can tell. What about the learning from the consumers directly? You alluded to that at some stage, saying that there was transmission of emails at networks, but and maybe it doesn't happen so much, but you're changing your product because you get a closer relationship with the consumer in the diversification. So is there any evidence of that? Because big companies do a lot of market research as well. Is there different types of advantages that you have when you have small products?
I think what they're doing, what they're able to do as well, is just to experiment a bit and to try to, because they are working on a small scale. So you can experiment in, for instance, doing let's say a chutney, for instance, and say, okay, and then you do a batch, and then if nobody wants it, you say, well, I've learned. I'm not saying that, I'll try something else. So I think that's what also when that operating at a small scale like that leaves them much more room as well to experiment with different types of products or new, and that's very incremental as well, because most of these producers, they always kind of adding maybe some new vegetables, a new range of products that they're able to sell as well.
Yeah.
But also they get feedback from the consumers in terms of, oh, this is a great product, I really like it. So and that feeds as well into why are they doing this kind of, why are they engaging in these types of market relations, that they get also some direct feedback about their product, which give them satisfaction that cannot be measured in kind of monetary terms, but also pushes them just to continue doing what they're doing.
But you were saying there's many types of close proximity. Some of them would be more effective in giving quick feedback. If it's product diversification, purely bringing on new types of services and all that other stuff, you still require fairly close communication, proximity, that's what the European markets in Malakia was all that are it's difficult to sometimes to separate the romantic, these things are quite enjoyable, the side of it with the real consumer information and
that's when
contribution.
if you remember these kind of three main different tours model. So for instance, at the farmers market, of course, it creates some kind of fun, but usually it's pretty busy at the farmers market, so you can't spend much time to discuss with the customers each and every one.
Yes, people just enjoy it.
But then, of course, for instance, in the Swedish case, for instance, when producers are on Facebook, they're able as well just to get some feedback also directly. And of course, that's where the kind of the 1990s investment in broadband in Sweden also, but also the kind of grassroots movements how to develop this mobile internet as well, just to is also impacting as well the ability for these farmers just to be out there and to be more visible as well. But then also in the last kind of phase when they try able to, for instance, to promote their products at certain events, community events, but also, for instance, some of these producers, there are some local restaurants that are more and more trying to use local produce, and where, again, for instance, the producer is invited at some kind of happening, so it gives also more new ways for the farmers just to market, I would say, not just sell, but to market kind of, again, not just the product, but the concept, the kind of.
Thank you, Alex.